The irony is that although women's clothing was so visible, the women themselves often were not. Their voices are rare in the historical record. Their writing, if it ever existed, is largely lost. But what we have, the sculptures, the frescoes, the burial art, shows us how they wanted to be remembered, clothed in dignity, draped in meaning, framed by the fabric that shaped their lives. This video is a quiet attempt to remember them, not just as wives or mothers, but as individuals whose clothing revealed entire worlds. Through fashion, we can understand their values, their limitations, and their resilience. We can read in silk and wool the poetry of a life once lived. So as we begin this journey, let us imagine not just the clothing but the hands that wore it. The woman who adjusted her stola in the morning light. The girl who smiled at her reflection in a polished bronze mirror. The mother who folded her daughter's tunic with care. These were not silent statues or nameless shadows. These were real women. And through their fashion they speak again. Color, fabric, and texture, the language of luxury. To understand the fashion of Roman women is to understand how color, texture, and fabric weren't just visual choices. They were part of a language. A quiet, intricate language spoken in folds of cloth and the gleam of woven thread. Each color carried weight. Each texture whispered a message. And the very fabric itself could signal where a woman stood in the grand, invisible pyramid of Roman society. Wool was the foundation of Roman textiles. Spun from sheep across the countryside, wool was abundant, practical, and deeply woven into Roman identity. It was warm in winter, light in summer, and easy to dye, making it the most accessible material for Roman clothing. For everyday women, the vendors, the housekeepers, the mothers, wool was the constant. They wore it daily, worked it with their own hands, and passed it on between generations. But within this common material, there was room for beauty. Some wool was coarse, while other varieties were fine and soft. Some were bleached to a clean ivory, others were left natural in warm grays and browns. Spinning wool was a woman's work, and so the texture of a garment often reflected the skill of the hands that made it. Linen, made from flax, was another common fabric, prized especially in warmer provinces. It was cooler than wool and more difficult to produce, which made it slightly more luxurious. Linen garments tended to be lighter, both in weight and in color, often worn as underlayers or in summer months. Then came cotton, imported in small quantities from India, and even silk, the rarest of them all. Roman women did not often wear pure silk, but when they did, it was a sign of unimaginable wealth. The silk came along distant trade routes, carried from China through Persia, arriving in the Roman Empire at enormous cost. To wear it was to declare one's access to the furthest edges of the known world. And yet, fabric alone was not enough. It was color that truly brought a garment to life. Roman women, especially those of means, understood the power of color. White, symbolizing purity and religious devotion, was often worn during rituals and ceremonies. Brides wore white tunics, and Vestal virgins kept their robes white as snow. This color wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about sacredness. Red, especially deep or rusty reds, carried associations of vitality, warmth, and sometimes sensuality. A woman wearing a dark red palla might be signaling health, beauty, or simply an autumnal mood. Bright reds, on the other hand, were rarer, often harder to produce and seen as bold, even brash. Yellow and saffron were also favored, especially by brides. These colors symbolized youth, light, and transition. A Roman bride might wear a yellow veil, called a flammeum, on her wedding day as if cloaking herself in the fire of a new life. Blue was a calming color, less common in earlier periods but gaining popularity later in the empire. It was associated with the heavens, with protection, and with certain deities. A soft blue stola worn in springtime might have been a quiet celebration of rebirth and calm. But the most powerful color of all, and the most closely guarded, was purple. Specifically, Tyrian purple, a color so rich and rare that it became synonymous with power. Extracted from the Murex sea snail in a long, smelly, and expensive process, Tyrian purple dye was worth its weight in gold. In fact, laws were passed restricting its use to emperors and high officials. Still, Roman women found ways to access other purples. lighter shades, diluted dyes, or purple trims, to signal wealth without breaking the law. Even a narrow border of purple thread along a palla could speak volumes. Green was another meaningful color, often associated with fertility, spring, and domestic harmony. A matron might wear a green stola during household festivals, her dress mirroring the fields and vineyards that nourished her family. Patterns and trims also played their part. Embroidery was popular among the wealthy, and patterns of vines, flowers, or mythical creatures would be stitched into hems and cuffs. These details added personal flair, visual interest, and a touch of artistry. Textile production itself was a deeply feminine space in Roman society. Women spun thread, dyed wool, and wove cloth on large wooden looms. The process was rhythmic and meditative, a domestic heartbeat that ran through Roman life. It was not just labor, it was legacy. Many Roman women were buried with their weaving tools as if to say, "This was my work. This was my gift." Garments were often layered, and texture mattered just as much as color. A soft inner tunic might be paired with a heavier stola, while the palla added a layer of visual and tactile complexity. Some women even mixed textures, smooth linen with embroidered wool, or a coarse tunic softened by a silk ribbon. And all of this was held together by accessories. Fibulae, the Roman version of brooches, came in endless shapes and sizes. Some were plain bronze pins, others were intricate works of gold and enamel. These not only secured clothing but also added weight, drape, and decoration. A belt, often just a woven cord or leather strap, shaped the body beneath the stola. A sash tied below the bust gave a gentle silhouette and allowed the fabric to cascade naturally down the sides. The look was one of modest grace, never tight, never showy, always in harmony with the body. There was also meaning in what a woman did not wear. Simplicity itself could be a statement. Some women, especially those in mourning or retreating into religious roles, chose garments in muted tones and unadorned cloth. Their plainness said, "I am devoted. I have stepped away from earthly vanity." Roman fashion was, in this way, deeply reflective. It echoed the rhythms of life: youth, marriage, motherhood, aging, mourning. Women didn't simply wear clothes. They wore stages of life. A young girl in a soft yellow tunic, barefoot in a garden. A mother adjusting her daughter's stola before a festival. An older widow pulling a dark wool palla across her shoulders at dusk. These images are more than history. They are living memories. To walk through ancient Rome as a woman was to carry meaning in every fold of cloth. Through color, texture, and touch, Roman women turned everyday dress into something sacred, something timeless. The life of elite women through clothing. In the grand atriums of marble villas, under ceilings painted with birds in flight and gods in clouds, the elite women of ancient Rome moved through their days with grace and calculation. Every fold of their clothing was deliberate. Every color worn, every jewel chosen, was a reflection not just of personal taste, but of expectation, class, and the silent rules of high society. For elite Roman women, clothing was never just clothing. It was a display of rank, a statement of wealth, a performance of virtue. And often, it was a form of protection, an armor made not of metal but of fabric, embroidery, and drapery. A noblewoman's day often began early, just after dawn, when the household was still wrapped in quiet. Her hair would be dressed first, an elaborate task requiring time and skill. Slaves trained in hair arrangement would comb, oil, braid, and pin each strand into place. For formal occasions, women of status wore towering styles, sculpted into coils and curls with ribbons or gold hairpieces woven throughout. Then came the garments, layer by layer. She would first be dressed in a finely spun tunica, the base layer, often made from bleached linen or soft imported cotton. This tunic was not the rough work garment of a common woman, but a soft, smooth, pale canvas ready for the layers above. Over this came the stola, and for the elite this was no ordinary stola. It might be made of dyed wool from the finest sheep, or from imported silks blended with linen. It may have been woven by expert hands in the eastern provinces or dyed in rare shades available only through costly trade. The elite woman's stola was long and flowing, pleated with care, and held in place with golden fibulae, large decorative brooches that glittered on her shoulders. The belt, or cingulum, might be embroidered, perhaps even encrusted with small jewels, and tied at the underbust, allowing the fabric to fall in soft folds along her body. Each fold of the stola added volume, softness, and dignity. The look was never tight, never excessive. It was quiet luxury artfully arranged. The palla worn over the stola was even more elaborate. It might be a deep emerald green or a rich indigo blue, lined with gold thread and hemmed in patterns that told stories, vines winding into dolphins, stars curling into eyes. She could wear it draped across her shoulders like a shawl, or looped gently over her head when stepping out in public, signaling both modesty and nobility. Jewelry was never absent. Bangles in gold, some plain, some carved with inscriptions. Necklaces of glass beads, pearls, or onyx. Earrings shaped like leaves, moons, or lion heads. Rings with engraved gemstones, each representing a protective symbol, a family crest, or a whispered promise. Even her sandals were finely crafted, soft leather dyed crimson or ivory, with delicate straps that wound up her ankle and buckled with polished bronze. But her outfit wasn't merely beautiful, it carried meaning. By law, a freeborn Roman woman could not wear a toga. The stola was her official garment, a mark of honor. In fact, for elite women, wearing the stola was both a privilege and a responsibility. Its presence spoke of marital fidelity, social respectability, and Roman values. The way it was worn, its length, the manner of its folds, all of this was seen and judged. To wear a stola too short might suggest impropriety. To wear too many bangles, too bright a dye, or too expensive a necklace could invite gossip, or worse, moral criticism. Elite women lived in a world where appearance was everything, yet their expression was deeply limited. They did not speak publicly, nor did they hold political power. But through fashion they found ways to assert identity, status, and even quiet rebellion. Some added Egyptian patterns to their stolas, nods to the empire's expansion. Others adopted hairstyles influenced by Greek goddesses, or wore bracelets shaped like snakes, symbols of protection and rebirth. And while Roman law gave women little control over property or political decisions, their presence, their clothing, was seen everywhere. At banquets, in temples, on feast days, in portraits. They were watched closely. And so, they learned to speak through what they wore. A woman attending a religious ceremony might wear a pure white stola with no embroidery, her palla carefully covering her head, her hands holding a sprig of laurel. Another, preparing for a dinner with important guests, might choose a dark blue stola embroidered with olive branches and wear her hair in soft braids pulled back with a golden thread. Even in mourning, elite women used fashion to express their roles. A widow would wear dark, unadorned garments, perhaps a rougher weave with a veil over her face. But the care in her dress remained. Grief, too, was performed with dignity. In the home, elite women had more freedom. They could relax their clothing, remove heavy jewels, and slip into simpler tunics. But even here, surrounded by family and servants, they remained composed. They were expected to embody Roman values, to be modest, graceful, and measured at all times. Clothing helped them achieve this. It was their quiet shield, a way to move with authority through a world that gave them limited voice. And when they posed for painted portraits or marble statues, the drape of the fabric told their story. A woman might be depicted seated, her stola carefully arranged, a scroll or spindle in her hand, symbols of learning or domestic virtue. Others were shown with their children, stolas flowing around them like protective cloaks. These images endure. They tell us what the written records do not, that Roman elite women were not invisible. They were dressed with purpose, aware of every symbol they carried. Their clothing was not an afterthought. It was their language, quiet, constant, and powerful. And so we begin to see her, the elite Roman woman, not in isolation, not as myth or marble, but as a living presence. Her clothing still speaks. Her colors still resonate. And through the silence of time, her elegance endures. The working women of Rome, fashion and function. Far from the grand villas and gilded salons of the elite, a different kind of Roman woman walked the sun-baked streets. Her feet were calloused. her garments simpler. Her life filled with motion, rhythm, and survival. She was a market vendor, a weaver, a baker, a wet nurse, a midwife, and her clothing, unlike that of her wealthier counterparts, was built to endure. For these women, fashion was not an artful performance. It was a matter of practicality, modesty, and occasionally, a quiet kind of pride. The most common garment among working Roman women was the tunica, a simple, sleeveless or short-sleeved dress, usually made of coarse wool or linen. It was straightforward in construction. Two pieces of fabric stitched together at the sides and shoulders, with openings left for the arms and head. There were no expensive dyes, no gold thread, no embroidery. The beauty of the tunica lay in its utility. Often, a second tunica, a bit shorter or thinner, would be layered beneath the main one, especially in cooler weather. These undergarments absorbed sweat and dirt, helping preserve the outer layer. In summer, only the lighter tunic might be worn. The color of a working woman's clothing was usually earth-toned. Natural shades of off-white, dusty brown, faded ochre, and dull gray were most common. Bright colors were too costly. Delicate fabrics impractical. These women had no slaves to launder garments daily. Clothing had to survive repeated wear. And yet, even in this simplicity, there were flourishes of individuality. A woman might tie a woven belt at her waist, not to emphasize her figure, but to keep the fabric close while she moved. That belt, though simple, might have a braided texture or a family knot passed down through generations. She might sew a small patch of color at the hem, not decorative but a repair from wear. Still, that patch might have been cut from her mother's old garment, carrying memory and meaning. Shoes were basic, leather sandals or soft boots in cooler weather. Many went barefoot. Jewelry, if worn at all, was modest. A plain copper ring, a string of beads, a small pendant shaped like a crescent moon for luck. The working woman's hairstyle was practical above all. Long hair was plaited and pinned, or wrapped in cloth to keep it away from her face. During certain festivals or rites, she might oil it, braid it more finely, or add a strip of colored ribbon. But on ordinary days the focus was on utility. Yet despite their practical needs, working women still cared deeply about appearance. Cleanliness, decency, and effort mattered, especially in public. A tidy tunic even if faded. A well-wrapped headscarf. Clean fingernails despite the day's labor. These were signs of dignity, of self-respect, of presence. And there were distinctions even among working women. A merchant's wife, helping with the family stall, might wear a slightly finer belt or a dyed shawl. A midwife might carry a satchel of herbs, her sleeves rolled carefully to her elbows, her tunic belted high to allow freedom of movement. Some working women wore the palla, though not always. For them, it was a garment of modesty rather than luxury, a way to cover the head and shoulders when out among men, or when entering temples. Often made of a single woolen cloth, the palla was fastened with a simple pin and worn without flourish. Wet nurses, who played essential roles in Roman families, had their own distinct look. Chosen often for their health and appearance, they wore plain but well-kept garments, and were expected to present themselves with care, not extravagance but stability. Midwives too had a recognizable style. Their garments needed to be functional, sleeved, washable with pockets or bags for tools. But their status in communities was high, and their clothing often reflected a quiet authority. Then there were the artisans, spinners, weavers, potters, bread makers. Their clothing bore the marks of their trades, ash smudges, flour dust, wool fibers clinging to hems. These were badges of honor. They showed productivity, purpose, and contribution. In workshops and markets, these women moved with strength and rhythm. Their clothing needed to stretch, to survive, to breathe. No one expected beauty, but care, yes. Intention always. And even among these women there were rituals. On feast days they wore their cleanest tunic. A shawl passed down from a grandmother might emerge. A necklace of glass beads saved for Saturnalia. A sprig of herbs tucked behind the ear. Modest touches but deeply felt. Some women also performed religious duties, as attendants in shrines, as caretakers of sacred spaces. Their garments, while simple, were marked by color and form. A white tunic for purity. A red sash for ceremonial work. The fabric might be coarse, but its message was clear. In public baths, one of the few places where women of different classes mixed, even working women could share in the pleasures of hygiene and beauty. There they soaked tired limbs, exfoliated skin with olive oil and stone, and styled their hair. It was a space of restoration. And on bath days, many wore their finer garments, even if only briefly. Their fashion was not meant to impress emperors or appear on mosaics. But it was no less meaningful. Every hem told a story. Every repair was a chapter of endurance. These women dressed for life, not luxury. For work, not display. And in doing so, they crafted a beauty of their own, one woven from effort, sweat, and dignity. It is easy to forget them. History favors marble and silk. But in the dusty alleys, in the bread shops and dye stalls, their footprints remain. Their tunics may have faded centuries ago. But the pride with which they wore them, that still lingers, quiet and strong. Sacred dress, clothing, and religion in Roman women's lives. Religion in ancient Rome wasn't just a part of life. It was woven into every thread of the day, every corner of the home, every breath taken under the watchful eyes of countless gods. And for Roman women, their clothing was not only a symbol of modesty and status, but also a vessel for sacred meaning. Whether offering prayers at a household altar or leading ceremonies in public temples, Roman women dressed with purpose. Their garments were not simply coverings. They were offerings in themselves, visual expressions of faith, purity, and devotion. Let us first step into the home where religion often began. The lararium, a small household shrine, stood in many Roman homes. Here, daily rituals were performed, incense burned, offerings made to the Lares and Penates, the guardian spirits of the household and pantry. During these moments, women often covered their heads with a portion of their palla, a gesture of reverence. The covering signified humility, a veil between the sacred and the mundane. In these private rituals, clothing was plain but respectful. Clean tunics, a fresh belt tied with care. The absence of jewelry, not out of disregard, but to show purity of intent. But religious devotion went beyond the walls of the home. Women played crucial roles in Roman religious life, both publicly and privately. The most revered of these roles was that of the Vestal Virgins, priestesses of the goddess Vesta, keeper of the eternal flame. Selected as young girls from noble families, these women vowed 30 years of chastity and service. Their clothing reflected this sacred duty. The Vestals wore a long white tunic, called a stola candida, symbolic of their purity. A woolen sash, known as the infula, was wrapped around their heads, and the suffibulum, a white veil bordered in purple, was draped over their hair when performing rituals. Their attire was simple but ceremonial, expressing their unique position: sacred, separate, honored. Outside the Temple of Vesta, few women held roles as visible, but many participated in religious festivals, known as Ferii, which filled the Roman calendar. During the Matronalia, a festival honoring Juno Lucina, goddess of childbirth, married women dressed in their finest stolas and walked together to the temple bearing offerings. White garments were preferred, bleached wool, clean and bright under the Roman sun, accompanied by modest jewelry. The emphasis was on feminine virtue, grace, and generational continuity. Another important ritual was the Lupercalia, an older, more primal festival held in mid-February. While the ceremony was mainly carried out by men, women were key participants, standing in crowds to receive symbolic lashes with goatskin thongs, believed to ensure fertility. Their clothing on these days was both protective and revealing, a strange mixture of ritual modesty and openness to sacred touch. And then there were funerary rites, where clothing took on the weight of grief. Widows and female mourners wore dark tunics, often in shades of brown, gray, or black. Jewelry was removed, hair was unadorned, and veils were drawn low. This was not a time for beauty but for solemnity. Their clothing expressed the soul's burden. And even after the funeral, widows continued to wear mourning garb for extended periods, especially during the 9 days of formal lamentation called the Novendialis. For women who served as sacerdotes or priestesses, their garments were tied to the deity they served. A priestess of Ceres, goddess of agriculture, might wear a green sash or a garland of wheat. A devotee of Diana, goddess of the hunt, could don a shorter tunic, symbolizing movement and strength. The gods and goddesses shaped not only rituals but the very fabric and color of the garments worn. Clothing also served as a way to identify one's religious affiliation, especially in mystery cults and foreign religions that gained popularity during the empire. In the cult of Isis, imported from Egypt, Roman women participated in secretive, symbolic rituals. They wore flowing garments that echoed the Nile, long, pleated robes in linen, sashes tied in intricate knots, and veils that covered the hair. Unlike traditional Roman religious dress, these garments were more sensual, more theatrical, reflecting the mysticism of the rites. Similarly, in the cult of Cybele, the Magna Mater, priestesses wore wild, untamed clothing, their hair loose, their tunics bright with reds and oranges. Their rituals were loud, ecstatic, emotional. Clothing, in these cases, was not about modesty, it was about transformation. Even Christian women in the later empire had their own codes. Early Christian communities favored simplicity and humility. Female followers, especially those who had taken vows of chastity or widowhood, wore undyed garments, loose and without decoration. This was both a spiritual and a political choice, a quiet defiance against the opulence of Roman society. But across all religions, across all rites and ceremonies, the common thread remained: clothing as reverence. It was in the way a woman drew her veil when praying, the careful folding of a sash before entering a temple, the absence of adornment in mourning, the color white for purity, the color black for loss. And though we often picture ancient Rome as a place of marble statues and roaring crowds, the truth is quieter. In temples filled with incense and candlelight, in kitchens where small shrines glowed in alcoves, in marketplaces where goddesses were honored with bread and oil, Roman women practiced their faith with grace. Their garments, though lost to time, once whispered of devotion. They rustled through holy spaces. They were laid down in offerings. They were soaked in tears. They were lifted in joy. And through these sacred garments they reached toward something greater, something eternal. Beauty, hairstyles, and the art of adornment in ancient Rome. In a world without mirrors as we know them, without beauty salons or modern cosmetics, Roman women still knew how to transform themselves with patience, intention, and ritual. Beauty in ancient Rome was not an afterthought, it was a craft. A slow art practiced with care, and a reflection of values, identity, and status. Let us begin with the hair, the silent crown worn by every Roman woman. Hair was more than strands to be tamed. It was an intimate expression of age, virtue, and station. A young girl's hair was typically worn loose or in a single braid. It signified innocence, youth, and the potential for growth. When she married, her hair was ritually arranged into a special style called the seni crines, 6 braids bound together and secured with woolen bands, a symbol of her passage into womanhood and wifely duty. Married women wore their hair in updos, elegant, intricate styles woven high on the crown, coiled in knots, or shaped into buns. These weren't quick arrangements. Many styles took hours. Rich women had ornatrices, specialized hairdressers, often enslaved, who mastered the complicated folds, braids, and pins needed to achieve popular looks. These women trained for years, passing their skills down like a secret art. And as the empire evolved, so did hairstyles. During the Flavian dynasty, hair reached impressive architectural heights. Curls were piled in front, sometimes enhanced with wigs or false hair. Rows of tightly twisted coils framed the face, giving the illusion of a golden halo. These styles appeared on statues and coins, quiet declarations of fashion and influence. To maintain such beauty, tools were essential. Small bronze or ivory combs, heated curling irons, long metal rods warmed over embers, hairnets made of silk or fine wool. Even perfumed oils, scented with myrrh or rose, to tame frizz and add shine. Hair color too was a subject of fascination. Roman women darkened graying hair with mixtures of lead or soot. Some lightened it with ash or lime, especially after foreign influences made blonde hair desirable. Wigs made from Germanic or Gallic women's hair became prized items among the elite. Fashion, even in ancient times, was global. But the attention didn't stop with hair. The Roman woman's face, her skin, her eyes, her lips, was a canvas painted with great care. Cosmetics in ancient Rome were called cosmetica and were often made at home. For foundation, women used a base of chalk, white lead, or powdered horn to create a pale complexion, the ideal of beauty. This pale tone suggested wealth and refinement, as tan skin was associated with outdoor labor. However, this base wasn't always kind to the skin. Lead-based products could cause irritation, even long-term damage. But appearance outweighed health, and so women persisted, seeking that smooth porcelain look. For color, rouge was applied to the cheeks, made from red ochre, mulberry juice, or even crushed roses. Lips were tinted similarly, though some used cinnabar, a mercury-based pigment, for a richer red. Again, beauty had its cost. The eyes received special attention. Women outlined them with kohl, made from antimony or soot, creating a defined almond shape. This technique wasn't just aesthetic, it was also inspired by Egypt and the East, where dramatic eyes had long been a sign of mystique and allure. Eyeshadow came in greens and blues, made from malachite and azurite powders. Brows were darkened with burnt cork or antimony paste. A well-shaped brow was admired, it framed the eyes and suggested control and refinement. Perfume too was part of the beauty ritual. Roman women favored oils scented with lavender, myrrh, or rose. Some used elaborate glass vials to store perfumes, while others infused their garments by placing sachets of herbs in their clothing chests. A woman's scent was part of her presence, subtle, lingering, poetic. Yet beauty wasn't solely reserved for the elite. Even modest Roman women had their rituals. A bit of crushed berry for the lips. A braid refreshed before stepping into the marketplace. A clay mask dried in the sun to cleanse the skin. These were small moments of care, repeated across the empire, forming a shared language of femininity. Adornment didn't end with the body. Jewelry, quiet, glinting, was worn with pride. Earrings in gold, set with pearls or garnets. Necklaces of glass beads, strung in symmetry. Bangles of bronze or shell, clinking gently with each movement. Rings engraved with initials, symbols, or tiny cameos of loved ones. Each piece carried meaning, a gift from a husband, a dowry item, a prayer offered to Venus. Even the poorest women wore amulets, not for vanity but for protection. Tiny charms shaped like eyes or hands, strung on twine or leather. These warded off the evil eye, a feared source of misfortune and illness. Clothing accessories played their part as well. Fibulae or brooches were both decorative and practical, fastening tunics or cloaks. Some were shaped like animals, others like leaves or crescent moons. Over time they became family heirlooms, passed from mother to daughter, warm with memory. Footwear could also be adorned. Sandals for wealthier women might have colored leather or gold thread embroidery. But even the humblest sandals were polished, cleaned, and respected. After all, they touched the earth every day. The beauty of a Roman woman was rarely loud. It was composed, controlled, a harmony of effort and tradition. And yet, not all agreed on these rituals. Some writers of the time criticized women's use of cosmetics, calling it vanity, deception, even witchcraft. Others saw it as a noble pursuit, a mark of civilization. For Roman women themselves, beauty was more than appearance. It was discipline. It was expression. It was a means of self-care, even in a society where their voices were limited. Through each brushstroke, each plaited braid, they reclaimed a small piece of control, of power. Their beauty routines, like their garments, were extensions of selfhood. And whether preparing for a festival, a dinner, or simply another day at the market, Roman women approached adornment as a sacred, soothing act. An art passed down like a whispered secret. A mirror held not just to the face, but to the soul. Clothing, class, and identity, reading a woman by her dress. In the world of ancient Rome, clothing was not simply a matter of personal taste or function. It was a language. A quiet, visual vocabulary that spoke volumes about where a woman belonged in society, how much power she held, how others were expected to treat her. In a glance, one could gather her class, her morality, her stage in life. The fabric she wore did the speaking, even when she could not. We begin with the most fundamental truth of Roman fashion. Clothing revealed identity. A wealthy matron in the heart of Rome wore her status as clearly as she wore her stola. The stola, a long, sleeveless overdress, typically worn over a tunica, was a marker of virtue and respectability. Made of fine light-colored wool or imported silk, it was fastened with decorative pins at the shoulders and tied at the waist with a colorful band called the zona. The very presence of a stola suggested a woman was married, respectable, and from a family of standing. The palla, a large shawl or cloak, was another clue. Draped over the shoulders and sometimes drawn up over the head, the palla served as a signal of modesty. Women of higher status wore them whenever they left the home, while lower-class women or those with more physical jobs rarely had the luxury. The material of these garments was just as telling. Fine wool, imported linen, or even silk from the East. These suggested wealth and leisure. Coarse wool or unbleached fabric pointed toward labor, poverty, or practicality. The way a stola fell, the neatness of a hemline, the texture of the fabric, all could be read like a paragraph of social text. Color added another layer to this visual language. Bright white, often achieved through fuller's earth or chalk, denoted wealth and ceremonial presence. It was not a practical color for daily life. It stained easily and required frequent cleaning, and therefore served more as a status symbol than a practical choice. Only someone who had servants or slaves to manage laundry could afford to wear white regularly. Earth tones, like browns, ochres, and grays, were common among the working classes. They did not show dirt as easily, and their dyes were cheaper to produce. Bright purples, on the other hand, especially the deep, imperial Tyrian purple, were strictly reserved for the elite. The dye was extracted from tiny sea snails and was extremely expensive. In fact, only the empress or elite priestesses could wear garments fully dyed in this regal hue. Jewelry and adornment followed similar social patterns. A woman of means might wear golden earrings set with pearls, or bracelets made of twisted silver. A brooch, known as a fibula, could be simple or elaborate, depending on her wealth. Rings were especially telling, some carved with family crests, others bearing symbols of the gods, protection charms, or marital vows. Poorer women wore fewer items, but even among them, ornamentation mattered. A copper bracelet, a necklace of colored glass beads, a simple brooch. These were not just decorations, they were expressions of dignity, a quiet rebellion against invisibility. Footwear, too, carried social meaning. Sandals for indoor wear, soft leather boots for colder weather, or open-toed shoes with dyed straps for more public occasions. A woman's shoes were often a mark of how far she could travel, both literally and metaphorically. Hair offered further visual cues. Elaborate hairstyles, requiring hours of work, suggested access to hairdressers. Wigs made from foreign hair, blonde Germanic, dark Egyptian, were fashionable among the elite. Working women kept their hair tied, braided, or wrapped, styles that allowed movement without fuss. Even fragrance was linked to class. The oils and perfumes used by wealthy women were imported and expensive. Scent became an extension of identity. To wear rose oil was to carry the air of Venus herself. To wear no perfume might suggest humility or poverty. But perhaps most powerful was the idea of visual modesty. For Roman women, especially those of high status, how much one revealed of the body was a constant consideration. A tightly wrapped stola with a palla drawn up suggested honor, virtue, and marriage. A loosely draped tunica without a head covering might imply either lower status or scandal. Propriety was measured not only by wealth but by restraint. To expose the ankles or worse the shoulders could draw unwanted gossip. This was a society where modesty was currency, and appearance was often more important than truth. One notable exception was the meretrix or courtesan. These women were known for wearing more vivid clothing, often in red, yellow, or blue. Unlike matrons, they were forbidden from wearing the stola, which was reserved for married women of status. And yet, within their own world, they developed distinct styles that projected power and allure. Their jewelry was often bold, their hair elaborate, their fragrances unmistakable. They understood better than most the language of fashion, and how to wield it. Another key group were the freed women, women who had once been enslaved but had gained their freedom. Their clothing choices often blended the plainness of servitude with aspirational touches. A freed woman might wear a carefully pressed tunica with a bright sash, or invest in a single piece of jewelry that announced her independence. Her clothing told a story of transition, from bondage to personhood. Across all classes, clothing was also used to mark life events: mourning, marriage, childbirth, and religious devotion. These transitional moments had specific dress codes, and a woman was expected to follow them, not only to signal respect but to maintain social order. And so, walking through the streets of ancient Rome was like reading a moving manuscript. Every woman, whether walking to the market, visiting a temple, or standing on a balcony, presented herself through dress. Not everyone had a voice in Roman society, but everyone had a garment. Through folds of wool and streaks of dye, through pins and pleats, through scent and silence, Roman women spoke. And history at last has begun to listen. The ritual of dressing, mornings, mirrors, and moments. Before the bustling streets of Rome awoke, before vendors shouted their daily offerings, before the warm bread was pulled from the communal oven, there was silence. And within that silence, in shaded rooms behind clay-tiled roofs, the Roman woman began her day, not with haste but with ritual. To dress in ancient Rome was not simply a matter of covering the body. It was a process, a gentle, deliberate routine that required time, attention, and grace. Dressing was meditation, preparation, and, in many ways, a performance. A woman of means, upon waking, would first be assisted by her ancilli, female servants or enslaved women who were responsible for helping her with the day's attire and grooming. The room was often modest, with wooden furnishings, a chest for garments, and a speculum, a polished bronze mirror, oval or round, held carefully to reflect her features. Unlike modern mirrors, the Roman mirror did not provide a perfect image. It offered a softened reflection, slightly blurred, diffused. And in this gentle distortion, the Roman woman saw not flaw but mood. A canvas for transformation. The process began with cleansing. Water from a ceramic jug was poured into a shallow basin. She washed her face and hands with a soft cloth. Sometimes a touch of oil was applied to the skin, olive oil or rose infused, to moisten and soften the complexion. Then came the undergarments, the sublegaculum, a simple linen loincloth, and the tunica interior, a close-fitting undertunic. These garments were plain, practical, and worn directly against the skin. The fabric was usually undyed, in natural cream or beige, and tied with narrow cords or belts. After that, she would step into the tunica recta, a long tunic worn over the inner layer. It was loose but structured, usually with wide sleeves and belted at the waist to give shape. The belt, or zona, might be woven with dyed threads, decorated with embroidery, or adorned with small metal charms for luck or fertility. Some days that was enough. But for formal occasions, social visits, or religious duties, the next layer, the stola, was required. To put on a stola properly was an art. The fabric, long and rectangular, was wrapped carefully over the tunic, sometimes pinned at the shoulders with fibulae or brooches. The folds had to fall just right, the draping smooth and balanced. One shoulder might remain uncovered, depending on preference and status. The hem was checked to ensure it fell to the appropriate length, not too short, lest it appear immodest, and not too long, lest it gather dust. Then, with practiced hands, the palla, a wide cloak, would be draped around her shoulders. On solemn or religious days, it might be drawn up to cover her head like a veil. The palla was often the most decorative piece, dyed in saffron yellow, deep crimson, or pale blue, and sometimes embroidered with borders of ivy, dolphins, or vines. Each fold, each pull, each adjustment was made with intention. A crooked palla might suggest carelessness. A misaligned belt could hint at disorder. Dressing was about harmony, in layers, in color, in texture. And it wasn't done alone. As the woman dressed, she might speak softly to her attendants. She might hum. She might listen as a child recited Latin verse nearby. Dressing was not always private, but it was always personal. When the garments were arranged, the attention turned to adornment. Jewelry boxes, small carved wooden chests, held earrings, bracelets, rings, and hairpins. She selected her pieces thoughtfully. Not too many, excess was frowned upon. But not too few either. Simplicity could be read as negligence. Then came the mirror again. With no glass to offer precision, the bronze disc reflected the softened shape of her face, the tilt of her head, the curve of her mouth. She used a stylus or finger to apply a bit of rouge to the cheeks, kohl to the eyes, crushed petals to the lips. There was no rush. Each motion was part of a quiet choreography, a way of entering the day with presence. For the hair and ornatrix, her hairdresser would assist. Hair was combed with wooden or ivory combs, smoothed with perfumed oil, then parted and styled. Buns were coiled at the back. Curls were pinned. If she wished, a vita, a woolen ribbon, was wrapped around her head, a symbol of chastity and honor. Some women wore diadems, delicate bands of metal, around their foreheads. Others preferred a simple braid. But regardless of style, the hair had to appear tidy, deliberate, and in keeping with her role. Footwear was the final touch. A pair of solii, sandals with thin leather straps, were tied around her feet. If she were going out, she might switch to calcii, closed shoes with thicker soles, suitable for walking on stone streets. At last she would stand, silent, composed, prepared. To the outsider, she was ready for the day. But to herself, she had passed through a ritual. One that bridged the private self and the public role. A transition marked not by bells or clocks, but by cloth, scent, and reflection. Even the simplest woman, with few garments and fewer jewels, engaged in some form of this ritual. A morning splash of water. A freshly tied sash. A borrowed comb. Dressing, even for the poor, was a moment of pause, a quiet claim of dignity. And so, in tiled courtyards behind wooden doors, or beside cracked mirrors of bronze, Roman women prepared themselves, not just for appearances, but for existence, to be seen, or to disappear as they chose, to tell the world in folds and fabric, I am here, I am whole, I am ready. Festivals and formal fashion, dressing for ceremony. In the vibrant calendar of ancient Rome, the day was often shaped by more than routine. Festivals, rites, and ceremonies punctuated the ordinary with moments of grandeur, devotion, and public life. And on such days, the way a woman dressed was not merely a reflection of herself. It was a reflection of her city, her gods, her family, and her place within all three. A Roman festival day began long before the crowd gathered in the forum. For women, it began in quiet corners, by oil lamps flickering before dawn, or in open courtyards where the morning light crept slowly across mosaic floors. It began with preparation. These were not hurried mornings. There was time to wash, to anoint, to reflect. The garments chosen were ceremonial, and every layer carried meaning. The tunica alba, a white undertunic, was often worn for religious observances. It symbolized purity and readiness. White was not simply a color, it was a state of being. To wear white meant to arrive without stain, both literally and spiritually. It had to be spotless, freshly laundered, and often scented with herbs or flower water. Over this came the stola as always, but on festival days, it might be made of finer fabric. A woman from a wealthy family could afford one of light wool imported from Gaul, or even a rare silk blend brought from the East. If she was taking part in a ceremony, the stola might be adorned with subtle embroidery, a pattern of vines, stars, or sacred animals stitched into the hem. The palla took on special importance. Draped with care, sometimes with the help of a female relative or servant, it served not only as clothing but as statement. For ceremonies in honor of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, the palla was often pale and unadorned, to reflect solemnity. For festivals like Lupercalia or Saturnalia, when the rules of order were playfully inverted, women might wear brighter colors, looser folds, and even add garlands to their hair. Hair, in fact, was a ceremony all its own. A woman attending a sacred rite might have her hair styled into the tutulus, a high, conical shape associated with priestesses and matrons. It was built by parting the hair into sections, braiding them tightly and wrapping them around a woolen band, lifting the entire style toward the heavens. A white ribbon might be tied around the head, completing the image of piety. For festive occasions less solemn, public games, family banquets, or triumphal parades, The hair could be more elaborate, with ringlets curled at the sides, or fastened with bone pins and gold combs. Flowers, especially roses or violets, were sometimes woven into braids. The scent lingered through the day. And then came the jewelry. On days of ceremony, even women who wore little adornment normally would reach for their best. A bulla, a locket-like charm usually given to girls by their fathers, might be worn close to the heart for protection. Bracelets carved from ivory, earrings with dangling pearls, and necklaces strung with amber or glass beads brought color and movement to the ensemble. Each piece had meaning, some passed down generations, others gifted during rites of passage. Footwear too became symbolic. Soft sandals with dyed straps, often red or yellow, were worn for processions. The color red, in particular, was linked to life and protection, a thread that ran through many Roman traditions. And what of the festivals themselves? There were many, and each brought a different mood, a different dress. During Matronalia, a festival honoring Juno Lucina, goddess of childbirth and motherhood, married women would gather to offer prayers and gifts. They wore their finest stolas and carried small offerings, flowers, cakes, or incense. Their appearance reflected gratitude and reverence. It was a day for them, and their clothing reflected pride in that role. In contrast, Saturnalia was a time of joyful inversion. Servants dressed like masters, children wore garlands, and formality gave way to revelry. Women might loosen their belts, wear brighter fabrics, and laugh more freely. Even the strictest matrons might allow themselves a braid of ivy, a splash of wine-colored dye, or a moment of playfulness. In Lemuria, a quieter, more somber festival meant to ward off restless spirits, white garments were essential. The home was swept, the air was still, and even clothing became subdued. No bright colors. No jewelry. Silence was respected, and dress reflected inwardness. Weddings brought yet another style altogether. A bride wore a long white tunic, bound with the cingulum, a woolen belt knotted in the ancient knot of Hercules, a symbol of fertility. Her veil, known as the flammeum, was bright orange, covering her head and shoulders. Orange was the color of sacred fire, warmth, transformation, and devotion. Wreaths of flowers were sometimes worn, or simple woolen fillets. Her sandals matched her veil, dyed in flame hues. The total image was one of transition, from girl to woman, from daughter to wife. And for funerals the tone changed again. Mourning attire was marked by plainness. Women wore dark colors, gray, brown, or black. Jewelry was minimal. Hair might be unbound or veiled. The garments were not meant to draw attention. They were signs of respect, of quiet. And yet, even in mourning, a woman's dress told a story, not just of the person lost, but of her own resilience. In every ritual, joyful or grim, Roman women used clothing to shape the experience. They did not just participate. They became the ritual. Their garments were more than cloth. They were woven with meaning, dyed with memory, and hemmed with intention. They walked into temples with quiet power. They stood at banquets with dignity. They danced, prayed, wept, and rejoiced, wrapped always in the language of fabric. And so, if one were to step back in time, to walk down the streets of ancient Rome during a festival, one would not need to ask who a woman was. One would only need to look and listen to the way she moved in silk, in wool, in color. For in Rome the body spoke, but on festival days it sang. The quiet echo of fabric, closing reflections. And so, the story of ancient Roman women's fashion comes to a close. Not with a flourish, but with a whisper. Not in grand statues or military triumphs, but in folds of linen, in the glint of a fibula pin, in the rustle of a stola beneath a shaded portico. These women, so often nameless in history books, left behind no armor, no oaths of conquest. But they left textures, patterns, movements. They left the quiet elegance of a palla pulled gently across a shoulder, the patience of a braid coiled with care in the early morning light, the echo of a sandal's rhythm down the worn stone streets of Ostia or Pompeii. To understand their clothing is not just to understand fabric, it is to understand ritual, identity, and intention. They chose their garments not simply to be seen but to belong. To their gods, to their households, to the day ahead. Every layer told a story of duty, of beauty, of boundary, of rebellion sometimes, of devotion always. And in a world ruled by emperors and engraved in marble, it was the quiet dressers of dawn, the patient weavers of wool, the girls tying ribbons into their hair, who carried a different kind of legacy. Not loud, not famous, but enduring. Their fashion, like their lives, was shaped by expectation, yet they shaped it in return. They carved space for comfort and care in garments meant to restrict. They embroidered little dreams into hems no one would see. They pinned their hopes, and sometimes their sorrows, into the corners of veils. And now, centuries later, we look back, not to mimic, not to romanticize, but to see. To notice the details they crafted in a world that often overlooked them. To pause as they paused before a mirror dimmed with time. To reflect on what we wear, why we wear it, and who we become through the quiet act of dressing. So if tonight you find yourself drifting, let it be into the courtyards of ancient Rome, where olive trees rustle in the dusk, and women whisper softly as they fold cloth, where perfume clings to linen sleeves, and time slows, just for a moment. Thank you for spending this hour with me, not in the noisy halls of empire, but in the intimate folds of history's quieter half. Sleep well, and may your dreams be stitched gently in silk, threaded with calm, and warmed by the firelight of ancient stories.